Welcome to Magnificat TV News, dedicated to offering the news from the Church. Today is Wednesday, December 1st, 2021, and these are our headlines. The North American bishops have approved a document on which the Eucharist, in which they insist that one cannot receive communion in mortal sin because it is a sacrilege. The German Church has expelled the president of the Academy of Language for criticizing changes that have been introduced in tune with gender ideology. Two-thirds of the world's population lives in a country where the religious freedom is not respected, according to Aid to the Church in Need. The Archbishop of Paris has placed his office at the Pope's disposal after it became known that he had had a non-sexual relationship with a woman. A judge has absolved the editor of French Catholic magazine of the charge of publishing the Church doctrine on marriage. Respect for the Eucharist, which is Christ Himself, and as the consequence, one cannot receive communion in sin. That's what the U.S. bishops said in a document.
The U.S. Catholic bishops voted overwhelmingly in favor of a new document on the Eucharist that stresses the indispensable role of the sacrament in the life of the Church. The vote was 222 in favor, 8 against, and 3 abstentions. The product of months of debate and revisions, the final text avoids any explicit reference to whether bishops and priests should deny communion to public figures who disagree with Catholic teaching on abortion and other moral issues. The two sections of the 30-page document on the Eucharist are the gift, which focuses on the Eucharist as a gift of Christ through His incarnation, death, and resurrection, and our response, which focuses on gratitude for the gift of the Eucharist, the role of the laity in receiving the Eucharist, and the importance of the Eucharist in conversion. While the document doesn't provide any criteria for denying the sacrament to someone who is not in communion with the Church teaching, the text explains the differences between venial and mortal sins and says that a Catholic in a state of mortal sin should not receive the Eucharist. As the Church has consistently taught, a person who receives communion while in a state of mortal sin not only fails to receive the grace of the sacrament, but commits the sin of sacrilege by failing to show the reverence due to the body and blood of Christ, the document explains. The document says that the reception of Holy Communion implies communion with the Church in this visible dimension, and reaffirms the text of the Bishop's 2006 document on Catholics in public life. If a Catholic in his personal or professional life knowingly and obstinately rejects the defined doctrines of the Church, or knowingly and obstinately repudiates her definitive teaching on moral questions, in either case, he would gravely diminish his communion with the Church, the new document states. Reception of Holy Communion in such a situation, the guide says, would not be in accord with the nature of the Eucharistic celebration and should therefore be abstained from.
No less than the leading specialist in the German language has been expelled from the Church for criticizing language linked to the gender ideology.
The president of the German Language Association, Walter Kramer, has been expelled by the Church in Germany, declaring him an apostate for refusing to bow to the most bizarre tenets of gender ideology. In a letter published on November 17th on the website of the association he presides, Walter Kramer explains the reasons. With the increased use of gendered language, the Catholic Church is distancing itself from the faithful, Cranmer said. In April, the Central Committee of Catholics agreed to use the gender star for supposedly gender-sensitive language, suppressing masculine and feminine. According to Cranmer, in times of mishandling of abuse cases in the church and coronavirus-imposed restrictions affecting many parishioners, the church has nothing else to do but promote supposedly gender-appropriate language as the bearer of salvation. Instead of standing side by side with the faithful and speaking their language, the Catholic Church prefers to go with the flow that drives a wedge in interpersonal relations, says Cranmer, who is also vice president of the Academy of Sciences and Arts in Düsseldorf, and a spokesman for a special research area of the German Research Foundation. Cranmer's expulsion from the church has consisted of forbidding him to pay the religious tax, which automatically makes him an apostate. Cranmer then applied to pay the church tax in another diocese that was not a proponent of the gender change, but this was too denied.
Religious freedom is not respected in countries comprising 2/3 of the world's population, according to the study by Aid to the Church in Need.
According to the World Religious Freedom Report 2021, 2/3 of the world's population live in countries where serious violations of religious freedom occur. Violations occur, for example, in 42% of all African countries, with Burkina Faso and Mozambique being two prime examples. This year, the #RedWeek campaign will highlight how girls and women from Christian or other religious minorities suffer abductions, forced marriages, forced conversions, and sexual violence. The #RedWeek was celebrated this year from November 17 to 24, starting in Austria with an event at St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. A long list of buildings were illuminated in red, including the cathedrals of Montreal and Toronto in Canada or the Montmartre Basilica in Paris.
Archbishop Apetit, Archbishop of Paris, has resigned after it came to light that he had non-sexual intimate relationship with the woman.
The recent Archbishop Apetit, Archbishop of Paris, placed his position at the Pope's disposal is because he has been the subject of allegations accusing him of having a non-sexual intimate relationship with a woman some years ago. The Archbishop himself has made these statements. The word resignation is not the word that I used. Resignation would mean that I resign my office. Actually, I leave it in the hands of the Holy Father because it was he who gave it to me. I did this to preserve the diocese because as a bishop, I must be at the service of unity. The Archdiocese of Paris clarified that the presentation of the resignation is not an admission of guilt, but a gesture of humility, a placing at his disposal, and that the Archbishop took this decision because he understands that it can generate problems among the Catholics of the diocese. In 2020, it was learned of a 2012 email sent to a woman by Bishop Apetit, who at the time was Vicar General of the Archdiocese of Paris. The matter would have prompted the intervention of the Apostolic Nuncio in France and a successive investigation. Archbishop Apetit pointed out that when I was Vicar General, a woman presented herself on different occasions with visits, mails, etc. to such an extent that at times I had to do some things to distance us. I recognize, however, that my behavior towards her have been ambiguous, thus suggesting the existence between us of an intimate relationship and sexual relations, which I strongly deny, the prelate added. At the beginning of 2012, I informed my spiritual director, and after having discussed with the Archbishop of Paris at the time, Cardinal André Vintroy, I decided not to see her anymore and to inform him. In the spring of 2020, after having recalled this old situation with my vicars general, I warned the church authorities about it, the Archbishop explained.
Harassment by promoters of the gender ideology has gone so far as to sue a magazine for publishing the church doctrine on marriage.
The editor of the French Catholic news portal Renaissance Catholique, Jean-Pierre Mogend, has been acquitted of the charge of inciting discrimination against LGBT people. The Paris Criminal Court announced the verdict on Tuesday. In February this year, Mogender was charged with encouraging discrimination against a group of people because of their sexual orientation. The association Stop Homophobia had filed a lawsuit based on a passage from the article The Church of the Living God, the Pillar and Ground of Truth of Catholic Renaissance from June 2019. The article, signed by Cardinals Raymond Burke and Janice Pujats, Archbishops Tomasz Peda and John Powell Lenga, and Auxiliary Bishop Athanasius Snyder, deals with the June 3, 2003 pronouncement of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith on the Church's teaching on civil laws recognizing homosexual unions. In that article, the Church's teaching on marriage is explicitly quoted. Civil authorities should not legalize civil unions between two persons of the same sex that openly intimate the covenant of marriage, even if such unions are not called marriage, since they foster grave sin in such persons and give rise to grave scandal. The Criminal Court of Paris has ruled clearly and forcefully that the Church's teaching is not illegal. In its reasoning, the criminal chamber declares that the statements of the prelates do not result in incitement of the Catholic faithful to commit a deliberate crime against Article 432(7) of the Penal Code for refusing same-sex marriages.
Our editorial this week is dedicated to commenting on the persecution of those who do not accept gender ideology.
At the end of the 1980s, the Polish-born Jewish philosopher Zygmunt Bauman began to develop a thesis on the situation of society at that time in our era. He said that the society that used to be solid, with settled, firm principles on which people could rely and which were transmitted from generation to generation, had become a liquid society, a fluctuating society in permanent changes to which it was necessary to adapt. Well, if Bauman said that at the end of the 80s, 30 years later it would have to be said that his predictions have fallen short and that society is no longer liquid but gaseous. That is what the Pope said this week at the Wednesday audience. We live in a gaseous society. A gaseous society where there is no point of support and where everything changes very quickly. Gases are not necessarily bad. For example, the air we breathe, as long as it is not toxic, but there are also poisonous gases. I will give some examples. A teenager in the United States has been expelled from his school because he had a conversation on the school bus where this teenager argued that marriage should be reserved for men and women. His classmate denounced him. He was expelled from school simply for expressing his opinion in a conversation between classmates on the school bus. This is not the only case. An important writer, very well known, J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter saga, has been banned from the events commemorating the release of the first Harry Potter movie because she dared to say that a woman was a woman if biological issue was. creating great discomfort in the transsexual community. There is a commemorative event of the movie based on her novels, and she is forbidden to attend. There are increasingly luminous voices that are asking that Shakespeare not be studied in schools, neither in English-speaking schools nor in another, because they consider Shakespeare to be racist, homophobic, and sexist. This is what is called the culture cancel, the culture of cancellation, a culture that reminds me, but much worse, of course, of those braghettoni of the 17th century in Italy that were painting modest veils on the noble parts of the paintings of the great Michelangelo. Of course, these are much worse, and in the church also exists this culture of cancellation. For example, the president of the German Academy of Language, that is the highest authority on the German language, has been expelled from the German Catholic Church for having dared to say that the changes introduced by the Episcopal Conference in the liturgy, changes to please the LGBT community, were changes contrary to the language, contrary to German language. He said that he spoke from a technical point of view as president of the German Academy of Language. The diocese to which he belongs has told him that he is forbidden to pay the religious tax. So he is automatically considered an apostate and is automatically expelled from the church. This man, a practicing Catholic, has asked to please be allowed to pay the tax. He wants to pay the tax. He has asked to be allowed to pay the tax in another diocese so as not to remain without confession or communion. If he dies without the religious service, he has been told no, that he comes from a certain place, that this is the diocese where he belongs, that he cannot go to another one, that he is out of the church. We are reaching this point of absurdity. They expel a man from the church for speaking technically that certain changes in the liturgy are against the language. The cancellation culture is reaching extremes that are not only of absurdity, but of authentic persecution. Unfortunately, there is still some trait of common sense. For example, in France, the director of a Catholic magazine was denounced by the LGBT collective because he had published in the magazine simply what the church says about marriage. The thesis of the church says so and so, copies the paragraphs, publishes them, complaint against the editor. Fortunately, the court ruled in favor of the editor, saying that at least in France, it is still not a crime to say that the church believes that marriage is for a man and a woman. It is still not a crime, at least for now. We don't know what will happen in the future. In Colombia, the Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court, has had to intervene to annul the sentence of a judge who condemned a Catholic YouTuber who had said the same thing, that God created man and woman, and it was for the man to be with the woman and the woman with the man. The court had condemned her to withdraw that video, and the Constitutional Court has told her that she can publish it. But it has dismissed the sentence of the lower court simply because of a procedural issues. We do not know if the procedure is improved in the worst sense of the word. We live in a gaseous society. A gaseous society where also the one who dares to say something that is not politically correct is persecuted. At the moment, they are not being led to any martyrdom, but certainly to persecution. I remember, and surely others will remember it too, not long ago when the debate on abortion began, they told us, "You Catholics are intolerant," because we defended life. You are intolerant. If you do not want to abort, they said, do not abort. But why do you have to prevent others to have an abortion, as if the question of the defense of life was a confessional question? If you don't want to eat meat on Fridays during Lent, don't eat. But why do you have to prevent others from eating meat on Fridays during Lent? They were putting abortion at a level of eating meat on Fridays during Lent, which is a confessional issue. If you don't want to have an abortion, don't have an abortion, they said, but don't be intolerant. Well, those who then were tolerant, who called us intolerant, at this moment they do not even let us express our opinion. A society in which there is no freedom of expression is a gaseous society, yes, but of poisonous gases. These toxic gases that are going to end up putting all those who do not speak or do not have the same opinion or even think like those who are in charge in jail, or depriving them of their jobs or depriving them of their studies. I believe that something must be done before it is too late, and for the time being we must stand firm, united to the church, and pray until next week, God willing.
If you wish to be up to date about what is happening in the church, you can follow us in our news page, www.magnificat.tv. See you next week, God's willing.